We're going to talk about public opinion and what shapes it as a way to prepare you for understanding more about this unit. First off, political socialization is a really important term to understand. It means the process by which one develops political beliefs. Everyone in our society is developed politically, and it happens through political socialization. Family is the biggest influence on a person's political socialization. And that's important to understand that there are lots of things that go into shaping a person individually, politically, but family is the number one predictor. So, for example, people that are raised by Democrats are more likely to be Democrats themselves. Similarly, people that are raised by Republicans are more likely to be Republicans themselves. And so, also, people that are raised by independents are more likely to be independents themselves. And so it's important to understand that how you think politically about the world is greatly shaped by the messages that your parents send you, even if they aren't being sent to you overtly. There are other things that can affect you politically in terms of developing your political socialization and making you conscious about things politically. So school and college can play a big role. So for example, if you think about the impact of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, that radically changed America, and that now all of a sudden people had interactions with people that were racially different from them. Or if you think about public schools, you can have relationships with people who are from a different class background as you. And so school really can play a factor in terms of shaping that. But interestingly, there is a relationship between how long people are in school and how tolerant they are of people that are different than them. So if you go to high school, you learn a certain degree of tolerance of people who are different from you, but that increases with every period of education. So people who go to college are more likely to be tolerant of people that are different from them, master's degree, PhDs. And so the more education you get, the more liberal your attitudes are about people that are of different races than you, different religions than you, etc. And so that's an interesting factor to show that political socialization. Similarly, your peer group, particularly people that are of the same race and ethnic heritage as you, tend to view political events the same way. So, for example, if you were to ask Americans whether or not race is still a significant factor in American politics, African Americans are going to answer that question differently than white people. And that has everything to do with their experience. Similarly, if you're going to ask white people versus black people, whether or not they think that racial profiling is an issue in police conduct, white people answer that question more often differently than black people do. And that has everything to do with people's experiences that then socialize them politically. Media. Media plays a big factor in shaping our views, but it's more likely to shape what we think is important rather than the media changing our viewpoints. So for example, you can't take a liberal person and put them in front of Fox News for a month and then have them turn into a conservative. Media doesn't have that power, but media does have the power to influence what we think is important in our society. In terms of like what media you watch is a pretty good predictor for whether or not you think things like the wall in Mexico is important or climate change is important. Like it definitely has the ability to put things on our radar and to elevate things that we think are important. In terms of looking at the social environments that we're in, your religious institutions, or if you participate in one, has the ability to shape your political socialization. There's a pretty big relationship between the degree to which you go to church, how often, or that you go to your religious services, how often, and then what your political viewpoint is. Edwards, your textbook author, talks about this as religiosity, in that the more likely you are to go to church or to religious service, and the more likely you're to say that God is an important factor in your life, the more likely you are to have a more conservative viewpoint on things socially. Civic organizations are important. So if you're in a voluntary organization or if you volunteer, that can shape your political socialization. So if you are in civic organizations with other people that are just like you, that can reinforce your opinions. But also, if you're in a civic organization where you're with people that are different than you, that can also change your political viewpoint and help you see things from another perspective. Lastly, In the United States, we are pretty divided geographically in terms of how we look at things politically. If you were raised in New York City or in Boston, you are more likely to see things the way that other urban, people from the East Coast see than if you were raised in, let's say, Worthington, Minnesota, where I was raised, which is in a very conservative part of Minnesota. And so the geography, the place where you are raised also has a big factor in shaping how you view things politically. Also, major political events shape our politics and can change how we shape our politics. So, for example, before these two watershed events of Vietnam and Watergate, your average American would say in public opinion polling that they found that they trusted their government. However, we have never regained that level of public opinion and trust towards the U.S. government since then. On average, now Americans are more likely to say no, they don't trust their government. And that is definitely, there's a direct causal point in that in terms of moments like Vietnam, and specifically think about the Pentagon Papers case and then the issue of Watergate. In terms of in the United States, more recently, if you think about 9/11, after 9/11, both men and women were more likely to say that they saw issues of national security as being the most important, whereas previously to 9/11, women were more likely to say that issues of social services, particularly education and healthcare, were more important, and men were more likely to say that national defense was more important. But that changed after 9/11, so that was an example of a watershed moment that changed public opinion. We now, in 2019, are back to a similar place where we were before 9/11, but it's important to understand how those political events can shift things. In the United States, we are not independent of the rest of the globe. Because of globalization, a YouTube video that's made in Syria can be disseminated globally and influence what Americans think about U.S. involvement in that conflict. And so it's important to understand that, globalization also has the potential to shift political socialization because we are not in our own isolated bubble. When you look at public opinion, as people age, their opinions change, and so age group is another factor in terms of looking at political socialization. So young people, there's a lot of different sort of, categories of young people. You've got your Gen Xers and, etc. But we're just going to look at, for example, millennials, people who are 35 and under. Their public opinion on some key public policy questions is very different than people over the age of 35. So, for example, people 35 and under are way more accepting of interracial marriage than any other generation in American politics. They're way more accepting of LGBT people than any other generation previously, and way more accepting of the liberalization of laws to legalize marijuana than any other previous generation. Okay? If you take a look at, for example, the silent generation, which is what AMSCO refers to as 65 and older, they are more likely to be shaped by events like the Vietnam War, but also the Cold War, and they're more likely to oppose gay marriage and legalization of marijuana. They're also more likely to be reliable voters, and they're more likely to be Republican voters. And so where you are generationally has a lot to do with how you see the world and how you see politics. So that means that life cycle events have the ability to sort of change and influence how we see things politically. So a variety of physical, social, psychological changes that people go through as they age can shift how people focus on different issues, which makes sense, right? So you're thinking about college, so things like college debt are going to rank as a pretty high, thing in terms of what you care about politically in a different way than, for example, somebody who's 65 is thinking about things like Social Security. You think Social Security is way off. Somebody who's 65 has already paid off their college debt. And so that's going to influence how people think about politics. So this unit, we are focusing on public opinion, and public opinion is the collective opinion of many people on issues of government and politics. So looking at how do Americans think about the Trump administration? How do Americans think about the building of the wall? How do Americans think about the war on terror? There are many ways to measure public opinion. Public opinion polls are the most scientific and the most reliable measure of public opinion, which is why your text spends the most time talking about them. But it's important to understand that there are other ways that you can determine what the public thinks. They're just not as scientific. So, for example, you can look at election results. We had an election in November, and we had more women elected, and we had more millennials elected, and we had more Democrats elected, and that gives us an opportunity to say what the public wants. But it's not as scientific as a poll because we don't know why voters voted for those people unless we conduct a poll. We know that they voted for more Democrats. We don't know why they voted for more Democrats unless we conduct a poll. Interest groups have the ability to tell us whether or not an idea is popular. So, for example, the National Rifle Association is taken seriously nationally, and part of that has to do with how much money they're able to raise and how many members they have. So, interest groups can demonstrate that an idea is popular based on how many people are flocking to their cause or showing up to their events or giving them money. The media has the ability to both influence public opinion, but also to measure public opinion. For example, the media is not going to spend a lot of time on a story that you and I don't think are important because at the end of the day, they want to earn money. And so we won't buy their newspaper. We won't buy their magazine. We'll change the channel. We won't click on that article. And so the media both has the ability to shape public opinion, but it also mirrors public opinion. There are many different types of polls, and that's important to understand. So benchmark polls are used to gather general information about people's concerns and views. So right now, Senator Amy Klobuchar is considering a run for the presidency in 2 years. And so I'm sure that she has done some benchmark polling to try to get some general ideas about what would be the potential issues that, voters would be interested in. And maybe she would then be thinking about writing some legislation or doing some talk shows where she talks about those topics. But benchmark polls are used to gather that type of general information. Tracking polls are used to show a candidate's strength. And I haven't seen any tracking polls that talk about Amy Klobuchar, but I have seen tracking polls that talk about Joe Biden and talk about Bernie Sanders, and to the degree to which they're popular enough to be able to run for a presidential run in 2020. And I'm sure that other candidates are doing those as well. Entrance polls and exit polls are conducted on election day. Entrance polls, obviously, as people are entering the polling place. Exit polls as people are leaving. But they're conducted by the media to get a sense, before we actually have the results of the election, about who people voted for, but also why people voted for those candidates. Focus groups are different than polling, and they're different in that instead of having one person answering something by themselves in a focus group, you get a group of 10 to 40 people together, and someone who's an expert in public opinion holds a conversation with them and tries to get an idea from them about what their issues are or how they feel about a candidate. A focus group could use people from a variety of different sort of demographic groups, or it could be just a focus group with young people or just a focus group with African American people. It could be that them just asking them questions, or it could be showing them a political advertisement and then trying to get a sense for whether or not that political advertisement, how does that make this group of people feel? Do they connect with that candidate afterwards? Do they feel like that candidate was untrustworthy? But frequently, politicians will test drive their advertisements with focus groups beforehand. Lastly, you guys looked at some approval ratings already of the president. And so media organizations ask if the public approves of a president's job performance. And those play a pretty significant role in terms of whether or not the president has any political capital to use in his or her negotiations with Congress. In order to conduct an accurate poll, one needs to have unbiased questions. If you don't have unbiased questions, you're leading the person who's answering the question, and they could end up giving you an answer just because they think that's the answer you want. And obviously, that's not a very valid measure of determining what they really think. It's also important that the person who is receiving the question understands the question, understands all their options for what they could pick, and that all of the options that really sort of that they would want to say are actually an option. Like if you only give people the choice of who would you vote for, Democrat or Republican, and really this person wants to vote for a Green Party candidate, then that question isn't going to accurately measure what they're going to do on election day. It's also important that when conducting a poll that you have a random sample of people that you are polling. Every single person in the defined universe, and that could be Bloomington people, that could be the state of Minnesota, that could be the United States, however you're defining that universe that you're trying to measure, every single person must have the equal chance for being selected for a poll. So our most famous polls that turn out to be epic failures are when they don't do this correctly. So for example, in the polling trying to determine whether or not people are going to vote for Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, there were some upsets, including in Michigan, where Bernie Sanders won. And people were like, but the polling data said that Hillary Clinton was going to win. But that's because they were conducting phone interviews, and young people disproportionately don't have landlines. And that's what they were using to gather this data. And so they couldn't accurately predict how many young people were going to turn up to vote, and the fact that they were planning on voting for Bernie Sanders. And so having a random sample is important. I like to think of constructing a random sample is like when you're testing your soup to see if it is done or to see if the vegetables are cooked properly. So when I make minestrone, I don't have to drink or eat a whole bowl in order to figure out if my minestrone is correctly cooked. I just have to stir it up, and I have to put in a spoonful, and I have to make sure that I got, a garbanzo bean, a piece of zucchini, a piece of red pepper, a piece of pasta, some broth, in order to be able to figure out whether or not it is cooked properly. So you want to have when you're creating a random sample, you're creating that spoon. So polling is important because it influences elections. So for example, when you're having a primary debate, you can't let every person who has said that they want to run for president be in the debate, because it's not a really clear debate if you've got like 17 people debating. So what most media organizations do is they say you have to have a 5% or 10%. They come up with some sort of cutoff. And if you don't have that level of popularity, then they're not interested in letting you be in their debate. Polling is also important because it influences policy debates and policy decisions in this country. Your members of Congress consider polling data when deciding what bills to write, when they're deciding how to vote on those bills. The president uses public opinion and polling numbers as he or she tries to influence Congress. So, for example, this week, the president made a public address from the Oval Office talking about why he wants and needs and feels like he deserves a border wall. And he was trying to talk directly to the American people to try to influence their public opinion so that Congress would be more willing to negotiate with him. Lastly, even the Supreme Court, even people that are not directly elected by members of the American public, they are also influenced by it. And if you take a look at when we saw how public opinion changed about gay marriage or about laws that banned gay sex, like you can see over time that the Supreme Court's decisions changed in correlation with how the American public's opinions have changed. And that's because the Supreme Court pays attention to what we think, and they have conversations with grandchildren, with people in society, and they want to be seen as a legitimate institution, and so they also try to reflect what the public is thinking.